They say Alaska is the last frontier, but they forget it breathes. It's a frozen giant that memorizes every name on its soil. In this colossal void, the question remains, who or what inhabits the silence between the city lights? Good evening, friends. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Tonight's stories transform Alaska into a vast, frozen morgue. If you seek the dark side, subscribe and help us reach 1,000 survivors. Leave a like. The show is about to begin. Welcome to the terror of Alaska. The sign outside says we're open 24 hours. That's technically true. What it doesn't say is that between midnight and 6 in the morning, open means one person, me, sitting behind a scratched plexiglass partition in a building the size of a 2-car garage, with a coffee maker that's been dying for 3 months and a phone signal that arrives and departs like a moody relative who never announces either intention. It doesn't say that the nearest town with a hospital is Talk, 41 miles south, and that the Canadian border is 83 miles north, and that in between those two fixed points there is, for the most part, absolutely nothing. Spruce trees and gravel shoulders and the Alaska highway running like a scar through the dark, and whatever decides to come down it in the middle of the night. I had been working the overnight shift at the station for 19 months when it happened. I want to be precise about that timeline, because the 19 months matter. They're the context that makes the rest of this make sense, or as close to sense as it ever gets. 19 months is long enough to understand what normal looks like on this particular stretch of road at 2 in the morning. Long enough to develop an instinct for it. Long enough that when something deviates from the pattern, some part of your brain registers the deviation before the rest of you has processed why. My name is Cole Muirhead. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Boise, Idaho, which feels so impossibly distant from where I spent those 19 months that it might as well be a different country, the country of strip malls and Applebee's and four-way intersections with traffic lights, the country where you can get a signal on your phone and a pizza delivered to your door and medical attention within a reasonable distance from wherever you happen to be standing. That's the country most Americans live in. That's the country I grew up in and left, because I was 28 and owed $11,000 on a credit card and had just lost a warehouse job in a way that was technically my fault, and had a friend named Garrett who'd moved to Talk for a construction contract and said the work was good and the pay was better and a man could reset himself up there if he was willing to work for it. Garrett was right about the pay. He was also gone within 8 months, back to the lower 48 when the contract ended, and I was still in Talk because I'd taken the gas station job and it paid enough to cover the credit card minimum and a room in a house I shared with 2 other men who worked the pipeline corridor. And leaving requires money I kept almost having and then spending on the things you spend money on when you're alone in a small Alaskan town with limited entertainment options and too much access to your own thoughts. The isolation was the thing I had not accounted for. Not in any real way. I'd read about Alaska. I'd watched the shows. I understood abstractly that I was going somewhere remote. But abstract understanding of remoteness is like abstract understanding of cold. The number means nothing until you're standing in it. The specific texture of the loneliness that settles on you when you're working a graveyard shift on the Alaska highway in January, with the temperature outside at -22 and the road completely empty in both directions for as far as the lights of the station reach, which is not very far, which is the point. That specific texture is not something I could have prepared for, because there is no analog for it in anything I previously experienced. The mind does things in that kind of silence. It expands into the available space, the way gas expands to fill a container. And when the container is this large, this dark, this cold, this empty, the mind finds things to fill it with. Thoughts that wouldn't get traction in a noisier environment. Questions you don't ask yourself when there are other people around to distract you from the asking. Is this what your life is? Is this what you chose? Do the people you grew up with know where you are right now, sitting in a fluorescent box on a road that doesn't appear on the maps most Americans use, waiting for someone to need gas? Most nights, Nobody needed gas after 1 in the morning. The overnight shift existed for the truckers, the long-haul commercial drivers running loads between Fairbanks and the border crossings, who appeared with the reliability of scheduled events, the same faces cycling through on the same routes, men who knew my name and accepted coffee and paid with fleet cards and were gone again in under 10 minutes. Between those visits, the shift was just me and the coffee maker and the particular sound that the wind makes when it comes off the flats north of Talk, a sound that is neither natural nor unnatural but simply enormous, the sound of a continent of air moving against a continent of trees with nothing in between to soften it. I had a routine for managing the hours. I'm not embarrassed to describe it, because anyone who has worked overnight shifts in isolation has some version of it, the small rituals of self-maintenance that keep a person tethered to the basic fact of their own existence. I counted stock at 1 a.m. I mopped the floor at 2:30. I made a second pot of coffee at 3 and allowed myself to drink it slowly, watching the parking lot through the glass door and the dark road beyond it and the narrow corridor of visibility that the station's exterior lights created before the darkness swallowed everything. I called my mother in Boise at 4 a.m. on Tuesdays, which was the only night she stayed up late enough that the call made sense. The rest of the week, I had podcasts and a paperback that I kept under the counter in the specific discipline of a man who has learned to make peace with the hours rather than fight them. That discipline failed me completely on the night he came. It was a Tuesday in October, which I remember specifically because I had just gotten off the phone with my mother. The call had run longer than usual. She'd been asking about my plans, the careful way she asked every few months, the way that meant she was worried but had decided not to say so directly, and I deflected in the way I always deflected, saying the job was steady and the money was okay, and I was thinking about what came next in a way that suggested I was not, in fact, thinking about what came next. By the time I hung up, it was 2:17 in the morning, and I had that particular hollow feeling that comes from a conversation that was honest in its shape but not in its content. I heard the truck before I saw it. The acoustic signature of the highway at that hour is specific enough that deviations from it register like a wrong note in a familiar song. This truck was running loud, the kind of loud that suggests deferred maintenance, an exhaust system performing at some fraction of its design capacity. It appeared from the north, which was the first thing that was slightly wrong, because northbound overnight traffic on the Alaska highway at 2 in the morning is unusual. The truckers run south at night, not north. Coming from the north at that hour meant coming from close to the border, which meant a very short run or a very long one that had started from somewhere I couldn't easily account for. It was a pickup. Full size, American make, maybe 15 years old. Dark color, I initially said black in my head, later revised to very dark green or dark blue, the kind of chromatic uncertainty that bad lighting and a brain primed for normalcy will produce. No plates visible from the front when it pulled in, which I didn't immediately register because the angle and the darkness and my own preoccupation with the mother call hollow feeling conspired to let the details slip past without being flagged. The man who got out was large. Not unusually large, just the solid, work-built large of someone who had spent decades doing physical things. Mid-40s, I estimated, though the face was difficult to read in the way that certain faces are difficult to read when the outdoor light is hitting them from below and the overall impression is of features arranged in an expression that could mean anything or nothing. He was wearing a dark canvas jacket and work boots, and he moved without urgency, which was itself a data point. A man who moves without urgency at 2 in the morning in a gas station parking lot in a specific location has either been here before or has decided something about the situation that doesn't require urgency. He put the pump in himself, which everyone does at my station because I don't get out to help in October at 2 in the morning at -12. I watched him through the plexiglass while he filled the tank, and that was when I registered the truck bed. There was something in it. Under a tarp, the way you cover anything you're transporting in an open truck bed in Alaska, the wind alone justifies tarping anything you don't want to lose or freeze. The shape under the tarp was irregular. Distributed. Not a single rectangular mass, not the outline of equipment or furniture or any of the other inert geometrically predictable things that people haul in truck beds. irregular in a specific way. I've tried many times in the years since to describe it precisely, and the most accurate I can get is this: irregular in the way that weight is distributed when it is settled rather than been placed. When something has conformed to the bed of the truck over time rather than been set in it at a particular moment. I told myself it was camping gear. I told myself it was a load of firewood or a dead animal. Hunting is constant in this corridor, men running game back from the interior all through October and November. I told myself these things while he finished pumping and replaced the nozzle and walked toward the door with the particular measured pace of a man who has decided where he's going and doesn't need to adjust his stride for anything. He came to the window. He pushed a folded bill through the slot, cash, which is not unusual at a gas station, but which I noted because the bill was folded with the kind of precise, habitual fold that suggests it had been prepared in advance, waiting in a jacket pocket for this specific use. He asked for the bathroom key without saying hello, without any of the preliminary small talk that lonely hours and isolated geography tend to produce in gas station exchanges at this hour, when people are generally glad to see another human face and let the gladness come through in at least some minimal social form. Just the bathroom key. I gave it to him and watched him walk around the side of the building, and I told myself to stop reading things into a tired man who needed to use a bathroom at 2 in the morning on a long drive. I told myself this with such focused intention that it almost worked. He was in the bathroom for 41 minutes. I know because I watched the clock from the moment the door closed, not consciously, not as a deliberate act, but the way you track something when some part of your operational brain has decided it requires tracking without fully briefing the rest of you on why. At the 10-minute mark I told myself he was tired and had sat down. At 20 minutes I told myself some people have conditions. At 31 minutes my hand was resting on the phone receiver under the counter, not lifting it, but resting on it, maintaining contact with it the way you maintain contact with a wall in the dark. When he came back around the side of the building and through the door and returned the key through the slot, I was looking at his hands before I decided to look at his hands. The decision was made somewhere below conscious thought, at the level where the brain processes information it isn't ready to formally acknowledge. His hands were clean, which is not, on its own, alarming. But 41 minutes in that particular bathroom, which I cleaned every 2 days and which did not have strong water pressure and whose paper towels were the thin single-ply variety, and his hands were clean with the specific thoroughness that takes time and attention to achieve. He looked at me through the plexiglass for a moment before he turned to leave. That moment lasted approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds of direct eye contact through scratched bulletproof plastic, and his expression during those 3 seconds was the same expression it had been when he arrived, the arrangement of features that meant nothing, that communicated nothing identifiable as a normal human emotional register. No warmth, no hostility, no tiredness, no relief at having stopped and rested. Just the face that some faces are, looking at me, acknowledging my presence with the minimal necessary investment. Then he said, "Are you here by yourself tonight?" Not aggressively. Not suggestively. Conversationally, in the tone that a person uses when asking about the weather or the road conditions. And I said yes before I understood that I had said it, before the word had cleared the mechanism of my throat and my mouth and the plexiglass partition and arrived in the air between us, because that is what isolation does, over time. It erodes the reflex. In Boise, I would have known not to answer that question honestly at 2 in the morning with a stranger I couldn't fully account for. In Boise, I would have said my manager was in the back. 19 months on the overnight shift in a stretch of road between Talk and the border, with the kind of loneliness that makes you tell your mother everything is fine when it isn't. 19 months had sanded away the specific social reflex that protects people from the wrong kind of honesty. He nodded when I said yes. Just nodded. Then he turned and walked back to his truck and got in and pulled back onto the Alaska highway heading north, toward the border, into the dark. I stood at the window and watched the taillights disappear and then stood there for another minute after they were gone, in the particular silence of a place that has just had something in it and no longer does. My heart was doing something in my chest that it doesn't normally do. My hands were not entirely steady when I reached for the coffee pot. I could not tell you, even then, exactly what I was afraid of. That's the most honest accounting I can give. I had no specific, articulable fear, no evidence of anything criminal, no clear wrongdoing I could point to. A man had bought gas and used the bathroom for a long time and asked if I was alone and left. Those are not crimes. Those are not even particularly alarming events when described in sequence without the tissue of context that surrounded them, the size, the cash, the note plates, the truck bed with its settled irregular weight, the 41 minutes, the clean hands. The absence of plates is what I finally called the troopers about. I called the talk post at 2:58 in the morning and reported a dark-colored late-model full-size pickup with no visible rear plate traveling northbound on the Alaska Highway, last seen at my location. The trooper who took the call asked if I'd observed any criminal activity. I said no. He said he'd note it and pass it to the border post. He sounded like a man who'd received this call before in variations and who had learned to keep his voice level in the face of rural paranoia, which is how he'd have filed it, rural paranoia, if I hadn't given him the plate detail, which he did apparently follow up on, because the Alaska State Trooper's log shows a check requested on that corridor that night, though no vehicle matching the description was flagged at the border crossing. 3 weeks later, a woman named Sandra Pruitt was reported missing from Destruction Bay, Yukon. She had last been seen at a gas station. The Yukon RCMP posted the missing persons notice on a database that crosses with Alaska State Trooper records, and someone, I don't know who, I've never been told specifically who, made a connection between the corridor check I've requested and the timeline of Sandra Pruitt's disappearance and called me. A trooper from TALK came out to the station on a Thursday afternoon and I sat with him in the break room that's barely large enough to contain 2 chairs and a table and told him everything I've just told you. The hands. The 41 minutes. The truck bed. Are you here by yourself tonight? He wrote it all down. He asked me to look at photographs, a series of men roughly matching the description I given, and I looked at all of them and I couldn't make a certain identification because the light that night had been what it was and certainty has a threshold I didn't meet. I told him that. He nodded and wrote that down too. Sandra Pruitt has not been found. The investigation, as far as I'm aware, remains open in the technical sense that investigations remain open when they have no body, no confirmed suspect, no jurisdiction consensus between Alaska and the Yukon that makes coordination simple. I received no updates. I am not a party to it in any formal sense. I was a witness to nothing. I saw a man buy gas. I left the station 6 weeks after the trooper's visit. I gave 2 weeks' notice and drove to TALK and put the last of what I had in my account onto a plane ticket to Boise, and my mother picked me up from the airport and did not ask me the questions she'd been saving because she looked at my face and understood that the questions could wait. I slept in my childhood bedroom for 3 days. I ate my mother's food and watched television without any of the shows registering and let the specific texture of American suburban normalcy, the neighbor's lawnmower, the pizza delivery car, the sound of other people's lives at a comfortable and unthreatening proximity, wash over me like something I'd forgotten I was allowed to have. I am back in Boise now, permanently. I work days at a distribution center on the south side of the city. I make less money than I did in Alaska and owe more on the credit card than I did when I left, because resets don't work the way men in difficult situations tell each other they work. The math of escape doesn't usually compute in the favor of the person running the numbers. I know that now in a way I didn't know it when Garrett called from TALK and made it sound achievable. What I also know, and what I did not know before, is what I am capable of missing. Not Alaska. I don't miss Alaska. Not the cold, not the dark, not the highway and its sounds. What I missed, when I was out there, was the basic human confidence that the world you're in contains enough other people to make individual acts of violence statistically unlikely. That confidence is not a small thing. It feels small when you have it because you never notice its presence, the way you never notice a wall that's holding something up until it's gone and the thing comes down. 19 months in a fluorescent box on the Alaska highway taught me that the safety I'd grown up assuming was ambient, that it was a construction, maintained by proximity and population and the infrastructure of a society that can only extend so far before it runs out of capacity. Beyond its capacity, there is the dark. There is the road. There is the truck that comes down at 2 in the morning with something under a tarp and clean hands and 3 seconds of eye contact and a question that I answered honestly because I had forgotten, because the isolation had made me forget that honesty in the wrong moment is not a virtue. It is a liability. It is the thing that can end you. I check the locks on my apartment door every night before I sleep. I have a chain lock now that I didn't have before. I sleep with my phone on the nightstand, volume on, the talk state trooper post number still in my contacts for a reason I can't fully explain except that deleting it feels like admitting that something has been resolved, and nothing has been resolved. Sandra Pruitt is still missing. The truck with no plates drove north and crossed or didn't cross the border and disappeared into whatever landscape swallows the things it decides to keep. And somewhere, in talk, in Fairbanks, on the long corridor between the last American town and the first Canadian one, on some other stretch of highway where the dark is absolute and the sign outside says open 24 hours and there is one person behind plexiglass and a phone that sometimes has signal, somewhere, tonight, someone is asking a question they shouldn't be asking. And someone is answering it honestly. Because they forgot what it costs. Because the isolation took that from them too, the way it takes everything, quietly, over time, in the dark between the lights. Nobody becomes a rural clinic nurse in Alaska because it's the obvious choice. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because when I tell this story, and I've told it fewer times than you'd think, fewer times than the weight of it deserves, because most people don't have a framework for receiving it, the first thing people want to understand is why I was there at all. Why a 33-year-old woman with a nursing degree from the University of Washington and 4 years of emergency experience at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle would end up working night shifts at a 12-bed rural clinic 90 miles outside of Anchorage, in a town so small it doesn't appear on the maps that most Americans use, in a state that most Americans think about only abstractly. The way you think about things that exist at the edge of your conceptual map of the world. The answer is the same answer that brings most people to Alaska. Something ended and something else needed to begin, and the distance between those two things required a geography large enough to contain it. In my case, the thing that ended was a relationship of 4 years that had consumed the last good portion of my 20s and left behind a specific kind of exhaustion that isn't physical, the kind that lives in the decisions you made and the ones you didn't, and that requires more than a change of apartment to address. My supervising physician at Harborview, a woman named Dr. Carol Mentz who had worked remote medicine for a decade before coming to Seattle, told me about the Indian Health Service Rural Placement Program over coffee one afternoon when I must have looked the way I felt. She said, sometimes the only thing that works is being needed in a place that has no one else. I applied 2 weeks later. I was placed at the Ridgepoint Community Clinic, which is not actually in a town called Ridgepoint. Ridgepoint is the name the original landowners gave their property in the 1940s, and it stuck to the clinic the way names stick in Alaska, through decades of irrelevance, but rather in the valley corridor between Wasilla and the western edge of the Talkeetna Mountains, at the end of a state-maintained road that becomes a county-maintained road that becomes, eventually, a suggestion. The nearest full emergency department was Matanuska-Susitna Regional Medical Center in Palmer, 46 miles south. The nearest trauma center was Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage, 91 miles. In the lower 48, 91 miles is a commute. In Alaska, in January, at night, on roads that the state maintains in a philosophical rather than a practical sense, 91 miles is the distance between what we could do and what needed to be done, and learning to live in that gap was the central education of my time there. We were not equipped for what a level 1 trauma center is equipped for. We were equipped for what a clinic 90 miles from one is equipped for, stabilization, triage, the management of situations until better resources could be brought to bear on them, and the quiet ongoing care of a population that had no other option and had learned, over generations, to make peace with that. I worked nights because the day shift nurse, a man named Gerald Otna who had grown up in the valley and who possessed the specific, magnificent competence of someone who has spent 30 years doing a difficult job in a difficult place without complaint, had a family that needed him present in the evenings. I worked nights because I was new and new people get the shifts nobody else wants, which is as true in rural Alaska as it is in any hospital in any city in the country. And I worked nights because, in the early months, the isolation of the night shift suited the thing I come here to process, the quiet, the reduced social demand, the long hours between patients when I could sit at the nursing station with a cup of tea and the particular darkness outside the clinic windows and feel, for the first time in years, that the space around me was large enough to breathe in. That changed. The way everything changes in Alaska, not with an announcement, not with preparation, but with a specific event that rearranges the way you understand everything that came before it. The man came in on a Thursday night in February, at 11:47. I remember the exact time because I had just logged a medication inventory and the timestamp was still on my screen when the door opened. February in the valley is a specific kind of cold, not the spectacular, newsworthy cold of Fairbanks or the interior, but a damp, settled cold that gets into structures and makes them feel provisional, like they're being tolerated rather than supported by the ground they sit on. I had the heater running in the waiting area and the overhead fluorescents were doing what fluorescents do in cold clinics at midnight, buzzing almost inaudibly, casting the kind of light that makes everyone look slightly more unwell than they are. He was alone. That was the first registration, not alarming, just noted. Patients come alone to rural clinics at midnight all the time. We serve a population where a lot of people live alone, a lot of people don't have someone to drive them, a lot of people have developed the self-reliance that extreme geographic isolation requires and which manifests, sometimes, as a refusal to involve other people in their difficulties until the difficulties have become undeniable. He was somewhere in his 40s, I estimated, the broad category of middle age that outdoor physical life in Alaska tends to compress, because the sun and cold and work do things to a face that make precise aging difficult. He was wearing a heavy canvas shirt, work pants, lace-up boots. He had the build of someone who moved things for a living. He was holding his left forearm against his body with his right hand in the way that people hold injured limbs, not in agony, not dramatically, but with the careful, deliberate posture of someone managing pain they decided to manage rather than express. I brought him through immediately to one of the 2 treatment bays, noted his blood pressure and pulse while he sat on the exam table, BP elevated but not critically, pulse elevated in the range consistent with pain response rather than systemic distress, and asked him what happened. He said he'd been working on an engine in his shop. That the skin had caught on something. He said it in the flat, abbreviated way that Alaska men often describe injury to medical personnel, not lying, exactly, but editing. The performance of stoicism that I had learned to read not as a barrier but as a code. What he said told me the category of the injury. The way he held the arm told me something else. When I removed the field dressing he'd applied himself, a clean cloth, folded correctly, held with pressure, I understood immediately that the arm had not caught on an engine component. The cuts were precise. That was the first thing, the first data point that the professional part of my brain registered and logged and began to process against the available explanations. Not the ragged, irregular damage of metal catching flesh, the tearing geometry of accidental laceration. These were linear. Parallel in some places, angled in others, consistent in depth to a degree that suggested a single instrument used with controlled, repeated intention. The kind of intentionality that exists at the opposite end of the spectrum from accident. I cleaned the wounds without speaking for a moment. This is a skill that nursing teaches you, the strategic use of silence, the creation of a space into which a patient can offer information they haven't yet decided to offer. Gerald had taught me the rural version of it in my first month. Out here, he said, you wait longer than you think you need to. These are people who have spent their lives not saying things. You have to give the silence room to work. There were 11 distinct cuts, ranging from 3 to approximately 6 centimeters in length, all on the flexor surface of the left forearm between the wrist and the antecubital fossa. Superficial to partial thickness, they required cleaning and closure but not surgical intervention. I began the closure process and I was 3 wounds in when I saw it. It wasn't immediate. The way I describe it to myself, in the private accounting I do in the hours when sleep doesn't cooperate, is that it assembled itself gradually, the way a word assembles itself from letters when you're reading a page quickly and then suddenly a specific word stops you because it doesn't belong in the sentence you thought you were reading. The cuts weren't just cuts. They were arranged. Intentionally or not, and by the time I was 6 wounds in, I had stopped entertaining the knot. They formed shapes. Angular shapes, geometric and repeated, the kind of shapes that have reference in written language. I closed wounds 7 and 8 before I allowed myself to understand what I was looking at. Then I set down my instruments and looked at the forearm as a whole, the way you look at something when you need to see it rather than process it, and the shapes result into characters the way one of those optical illusions resolves into a recognizable image once your visual system finds the correct orientation. Letters. 7 of them. Cut into the left forearm of a man who had told me it was an accident, arranged in a sequence that, when I traced them with my eyes in the order they appeared from wrist toward elbow, spelled a name. My first response was clinical. I'm not going to apologize for that. It's what training gives you, the ability to maintain the professional register when the human register is trying to override it. I completed the closure. I applied dressings. I noted the wound pattern in my chart entry with language precise enough to be legible and euphemistic enough not to alarm him while I processed what I needed to process. I asked, with the neutrality I'd spent years calibrating, whether there was someone I could call for him. He said no. I asked if he'd eaten. He said yes. I asked if he had somewhere to go that night. He said he did. Then I excused myself and walked to the supply room at the end of the corridor, which was the furthest point in the clinic from the treatment bay, and I stood there for approximately 90 seconds doing the specific breathing exercise that Dr. Mintz had taught me years ago for moments in emergency medicine when the body's alarm system outpaces the mind's ability to direct a response. 4 counts in. Hold 4. 4 counts out. Hold 4. Repeat until the hands are usable. Her name, the name on his arm, was Mackenzie Reese. I knew it because it had been on the board. We kept a board in the staff break room, a plain whiteboard that Gerald updated monthly with community health notices and, when relevant, information shared by the Matsu Borough Emergency Services Network about local situations that medical personnel should be aware of. Mackenzie Reese was 11 years old. She had been missing from her home in the Willow area, 40 miles south of us, for 8 days. The borough notice had gone up the previous week, with a photograph, a school picture, the kind with the blurred blue background that is the universal backdrop of American childhood portraiture. Straight dark hair. A gap in her smile where a tooth had recently come out. The name on his arm was her name. I went back to the treatment bay and he was gone. Not gone the way patients leave when they're discharged, the orderly departure, the paperwork, the coat retrieved, the door held. Gone the way a room is simply no longer occupied when you return to it. The exam table paper was compressed in the shape of where he'd sat. The wrapper from a supply package was on the floor. He had taken his original field dressing with him, the cloth he'd applied himself before arriving, which I had removed and set on the side table. It was not there. I went to the front of the clinic. The parking lot through the glass door was empty, 3 vehicles, all belonging to staff, all present when he arrived, all present now. No additional vehicle. I went outside in my scrub top into the February cold and looked at the lot and the road and the dark in both directions, and there were no taillights and no engine sounds, and the gravel showed no fresh tire marks that I could identify in the exterior light, which was one fixture over the door with a 40-watt bulb that illuminated approximately the immediate area and nothing beyond it. He had arrived without a vehicle I had seen. He had left without one I could identify. He had been at the clinic for 31 minutes, including intake and wound closure, and he had walked out of a treatment bay while I was in the supply room at the end of the corridor, which is not a long corridor, 40 feet, maybe 45, and I had not heard the treatment bay curtain, had not heard footsteps, had not heard the front door. I called the Matsuburo emergency line from the clinic phone. I described the patient, the wounds, the name. The dispatcher was calm and professional and transferred me to a trooper post in Palmer, where I repeated everything to a sergeant named Erickson who asked precise questions and wrote down precise answers and told me a unit would be dispatched to check the clinic area and that he would be coordinating with the Mackenzie Reese investigation team. He asked me not to leave the clinic. I did not leave the clinic. I sat at the nursing station with every interior light on, every light in the building, including the supply room and the staff bathroom and the small break room with the whiteboard, and I watched the parking lot through the glass door, and I thought about the things you think about in the specific crisis of a night that has gone wrong in ways that your training didn't fully prepare you for. I thought about the 91 miles to Providence and Anchorage. I thought about Gerald at home with his family and the way I thought, in the early months, that the night shift solitude was the thing I needed. I thought about Dr. Mintz and the phrase she'd used, a place that has no one else, and how it had sounded, in her office in Seattle over coffee, like a description of purpose. How it felt now like a description of exposure. The trooper unit arrived 40 minutes later. 2 officers. They checked the perimeter, checked the road in both directions, found nothing. They took my formal statement, which took another hour, and when we were done and one of them asked me if I was all right, I said yes in the way that I had said yes to that question for years, reflexively, because the alternative requires more structural support than the question itself provides. They told me to call if anything else occurred. They drove south. I was alone again. In the weeks that followed, and I want to be precise here, because imprecision is the enemy of the accounting I owe this story, investigators from the Matanuska-Susitna Borough and the Alaska State Troopers attempted to identify the man who came to the clinic that Thursday night. The clinic had an exterior camera, mounted above the front door, installed the previous year as part of a facilities update. The footage from that night showed the parking lot at 40-second intervals, a motion-triggered system, not continuous, and showed, on 3 separate frames spanning the period of his visit, a male figure consistent with my description entering and exiting the clinic. The vehicle that brought him, if there was one, did not appear on any frame. The plates of the vehicles in the lot were readable on the frames and belonged to staff, as I'd identified. The road beyond the lot was dark and the frames beyond the range of the exterior light. The man was not identified. I sat with a forensic sketch artist in Palmer for 3 hours and produced a composite that was circulated with the case materials. I was told it generated several tips. I was not told what became of them. Mackenzie Reese was found 14 days after that Thursday night in a structure on a property in the Trapper Creek area, north of Talkeetna. She was alive. I learned this from Gerald, who had it from the Borough Network, who had it from the trooper post in Palmer. She was hospitalized at Matanuska-Susitna Regional for 4 days before being transferred to a facility in Anchorage. I was told she was alive. I was not told anything else, because I was a nurse in a rural clinic and not a party to the investigation, and the machinery of those institutions has its own logic of information flow that does not include everyone who contributed something to the chain. The man who came to my clinic that night has not, to my knowledge, been publicly identified or charged in connection with the case. This is the part one carry with the most difficulty, not because I believe the investigation failed, but because not knowing means the accounting remains open. It means there is a figure, unresolved, at the edge of what I understand about that night. And unresolved figures at the edges of understanding are the specific material of which sleeplessness is made. I left the clinic 4 months after it happened. I gave proper notice. I trained my replacement, a younger nurse from Fairbanks who had the particular energy of someone beginning rather than continuing, and I drove to Anchorage and flew to Seattle and was back at Harborview within 6 weeks, working days in the cardiac step-down unit, surrounded by the ambient density of a major American city. The noise and proximity and collective human mass that I had once found overwhelming and now found almost physically comforting. I still think about whether it was worth it. That question follows me in a way I hadn't anticipated, not about what happened specifically, but about the broader arithmetic of it. Whether the months I spent in the valley, the genuine and concrete help I provided to people who had no one else, balanced against the specific cost of being the person in that building that Thursday night in February. Whether the thing Dr. Mintz described, being needed in a place that has no one else, is a sustainable basis for a life, or whether it is, in the end, a description of a vulnerability that certain people will always find and use. I don't have an answer I'm satisfied with. I have what I have, the memories, the certification I renewed in Washington, the apartment in Capitol Hill where the nearest hospital is 6 blocks away and I can hear the neighbor's television through the wall and the traffic sounds from 15th Avenue are, on the worst nights, enough to keep the Thursday night sounds from filling all the available space. The worst nights are the ones when I'm almost asleep and I remember, with the specific, unbidden vividness that the brain reserves for things it hasn't finished processing, the forearm under the clinic light. The 11 cuts. The letters assembling themselves from my hands into meaning while I stood there and thought I was doing something routine. The name, forming, in the skin of a person I couldn't account for, in a building 91 miles from anyone equipped to handle what it meant. And underneath the name, below the last letter, cut in the same depth and the same instrument as the others, a small mark I hadn't understood until I was in the supply room doing the breathing exercise and suddenly understood completely. Not a wound. Not an accidental addition to the pattern. A deliberate final mark, a single horizontal line followed by a vertical one. A cross. Or a plus sign. Or the beginning of something else, something he decided not to finish. I've spent years trying to determine which one it was and what it meant, and I cannot. That's the part one can't close. Everything else has an answer that I can live with, or almost live with, or will eventually live with. That mark does not. Some questions are not asked in order to be answered. Some questions are asked in order to be carried. I carry it. Every day, in the flat spaces between tasks, between patients, between the small maintainable rhythms of a life I've rebuilt in a city large enough to contain its own darkness without needing to borrow mine. I carry it, and I do not go back. Not to that valley. Not to that road. Not to the specific dark outside the clinic window at 2 in the morning that is a darkness I now understand, with my body, not my mind, in the way that real knowledge is always physical before it's anything else, is not empty. It only looks that way from the inside of the light. My parents bought the cabin the year I turned 11, which means I've known about it for 23 years and understood it for approximately none of them. That's not a complaint. It's just the truth about the things families acquire, the way certain objects and properties become so embedded in the mythology of a household that they stop being real things and start being symbols. The cabin was a symbol. It was the thing my father talked about when he needed to talk about something good, the fixed point in the family narrative that stood for possibility in space and the version of American fatherhood that involves flannel shirts and teaching sons to identify animal tracks. He found it through a land broker in Anchorage in 1998, drove out to see it alone first, came back to our house in Spokane with photographs and a look on his face I'd never seen before, the look of a man who has located something he didn't know he was looking for. It was roughly 60 miles northeast of Talkeetna, at the end of a road that was maintained by the state until approximately mile 12 and by optimism thereafter. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a wood stove, a functional kitchen with propane appliances, a loft my younger sister and I immediately claimed as territory. A covered porch facing west, toward a valley that opened into a view of the Alaska range that my father described every summer we came as the only view that made him feel appropriately small. We came every July, the 4 of us, for 2 weeks. We came for 8 consecutive summers. Then my sister went to college and stopped coming, and I went to college and stopped coming, and my parents came alone for a few more years until the road became too much for my father's back and the cabin became the thing at stay for the next decade, a symbol, maintained at a distance, paid for and insured and spoken about in the future tense. I'm 34 years old. I work in municipal infrastructure planning for the city of Spokane, which is a job that requires a graduate degree and pays reasonably well and produces, most days, the specific low-grade satisfaction of work that is useful without being urgent. I am not married. I own a dog, a 5-year-old shepherd mix named Cliff, and an apartment near the South Hill that I've been meaning to personalize for 3 years. I run on Sundays. I call my parents on Tuesdays. I am, by any honest accounting, a man whose life is fine, genuinely, measurably fine, in the way that requires no quotation marks, and whose primary existential difficulty is the low-frequency suspicion that fine is not the same thing as enough. That suspicion was part of why I drove to the cabin last August. Not the whole reason was practical, the kind of practical that accumulates quietly and then becomes impossible to ignore. The property taxes had continued. The insurance had continued. My parents, now both in their late 60s and settled in the specific comfortable inertia of retirement in Spokane, had been talking for 2 years about selling, and selling requires assessment, and assessment requires someone to go look at what you have. I had 2 weeks of unused vacation. I had a truck with good clearance. I had Cliff, who constitutes reasonable company on long drives and makes the kind of noise at night that means you're not entirely alone. I told 3 people where I was going. I said I'd be back in 10 days. I photographed the cabin's coordinates and texted them to my sister. These were the reasonable precautions of a man who reads enough to know that Alaska requires reasonable precautions and who has enough of his father's practicality to take them without embarrassment. The drive from Spokane to Talkeetna takes approximately 18 hours, which I split across 2 days, spending a night in a motel in Whitehorse that smelled like the 1990s and charged $42 for Wi-Fi that didn't function. I drove north and watched the country change the way it changes when you go far enough in the right direction, the population thinning, the distances between gas stations becoming meaningful, the mountains arriving on the horizon with the gradual authority of things that don't need to announce themselves. By the time I was on the Parks Highway approaching Talkeetna, Cliff had stopped looking out the window and gone to sleep in the back seat, which was either a vote of confidence or a fundamental dog indifference to geographic drama. I stopped at a general store on the edge of Talkeetna and bought enough supplies for 12 days, food, batteries, a propane canister, a bag of dog food, and the woman behind the counter, who had the weathered specificity of someone who has spent decades in a place and made peace with what it requires, asked where I was headed. I told her. She nodded. She said, "Be careful on that road after mile 15. They haven't graded it since April." The road was everything she implied and slightly more. Mile 12 to mile 22, which is where the turnoff to the cabin sits, is a class of road that exists in Alaska with a frequency that would horrify most American drivers, not dangerous in any technical sense, just absolutely indifferent to the vehicle traversing it, offering ruts and water crossings and moments where the correct path forward requires inference rather than evidence. I took it at 15 miles an hour, which is the speed that kept both my truck's undercarriage and my nervous system intact, and arrived at the cabin's turnoff in late afternoon, the August light long and golden and making everything look more manageable than it probably was. The first thing I noticed was the tire tracks. I noticed them because they were not mine. I had just made mine, fresh in the soft shoulder, and they were not old. Not last week, not last month. Recent enough that the edges hadn't softened, that the tread pattern was still crisp in the dried mud of the turnoff. A standard truck tire, single axle. Coming in, then going out, or going out and coming back. I couldn't determine direction from the pattern, and I spent more time than I should have standing in the turnoff trying to before concluding that I was probably reading significance into the ordinary. People use turnoffs. People explore forest roads. The tracks could be from a hunter, a fisherman, someone who'd simply turned around. Alaska is full of people who go places and come back, and the evidence of their going and coming is not inherently alarming. I told myself this clearly and carefully and drove into the cabin. It looked, from the outside, exactly as I remembered it. Same weathered cedar siding that my father had restained in 2003 and that had been slowly returning to its natural gray ever since. Same covered porch, same woodpile on the north side under a tarp that had developed several new tears in a decade of winters. Same padlock on the door, which my father had given me the key for, on the same ring as the key I had since childhood, kept in a drawer in my Spokane apartment with the specific casual permanence of things you'll always have. The padlock was closed. The hasp was seated correctly. I unlocked it and pushed the door open, and the smell hit me, the deep cabin smell of wood and cold ash and the particular mustiness of a closed structure in a northern climate, the smell I remembered from every July of my childhood, unchanged, reliable, specific. And underneath it, something else. Something that took me a moment to identify because it was faint and because my brain was busy processing the nostalgia of the first smell. Food. Recently cooked food, the residual olfactory trace of something that had been heated on the stove in the past days, not weeks. The faintly char-edged smell of a pan used over a propane flame. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Cliff had come up behind me and was standing at my left knee, which I registered without fully processing because I was doing the accounting that you do when a sensory input conflicts with a working assumption. The cabin had been locked. The padlock was intact. No window was broken. I could see the two front windows from the doorway, both whole, both latched from inside, which meant someone with a key, or someone who had come through the back, which I turned around to check, and the back door was closed and latched and locked with the same padlock that had been on it since my father installed it in 2001. I walked in. The main room was the way memory said it should be, wood stove in the northeast corner, the couch my parents had brought up in pieces and reassembled on-site in 1999, the table with the 4 chairs that had become 3 when my sister put one through the porch railing in a moment of adolescent enthusiasm in 2004. The same cast iron pan on the stovetop hook. The same shelf of paperback novels my parents had accumulated over 8 summers of rain days. Except the pan had been used. Recently. It had been cleaned, or clean enough, wiped with something that left a residue I could see when I lifted it off the hook and held it near the window light. Not dirty. But not clean in the way a pan gets clean when it sits on a hook for 10 years undisturbed. Wiped. With intention, with the specific care of someone who understands that evidence is a category. The kitchen pantry had 9 cans of food in it that were not my parents'. Not old stock from previous summers, these were current products, recent manufacture dates, the kind of cans you buy at a grocery store in the present tense. Beans. Soup. Sardines. Corn. Neatly stacked, labels forward, with the particular orderliness of someone who values arrangement. Alongside them, a folded wool blanket that I did not recognize, and 2 paperback books, thriller novels, generic cover designs, neither of which appeared in the shelf inventory I'd done mentally when I walked in. The bedroom was undisturbed. Both beds made with the same linens my mother had left, topped with the same quilt she'd folded over them the last time she'd been here. No impression in the mattress, no disruption to the pillow arrangement. Either the person who'd been here had slept on the couch, or they'd made the bed with the same attention they'd given the pan. It was Cliff who found the wardrobe. He went to it the way dogs go to things that have a set profile they find compelling, not dramatically, not with the alarm bark register that means danger, but with focused, nose-led directness, a straight line from the center of the main room to the wardrobe in the corner beside the wood stove. The wardrobe had been my grandmother's, brought up from Spokane in a truck bed in 1998, solid oak, the kind of furniture built before planned obsolescence was a design philosophy. It had a single door with a latch, no lock. I opened it. The wardrobe should have contained what my mother had left in it, spare blankets, the rain gear she kept here rather than transporting it back and forth, a pair of my father's old work boots he deemed too good to throw away but too worn to use in the city. Those things were there. They were pushed to one side, compressed, to make room for what was on the other side. A sleeping bag. A military-style stuffed sack containing what I could feel through the fabric were clothes. A headlamp, a multi-tool, a box of matches. The specific, minimal kit of someone living with deliberate efficiency, not camping, because camping implies recreation and recreation implies an endpoint. This was the kit of someone who had organized a life into its smallest portable components, someone who understood that having less meant moving faster. And behind this stuffed sack, folded once, a piece of paper. I have tried many times to reconstruct the physical experience of picking up that paper and unfolding it, and the truest description I can manage is that my body understood what it was going to show me before my mind was ready to receive the information. The specific resistance in my hands, not trembling, more like the increased friction of reluctance, of a mechanism trying to slow itself against the instruction it's been given. It was a list. Handwritten. A medium-point pen, black ink, the handwriting neat in the way that is more unsettling than sloppy because neatness implies patience and patience implies time and time implies sustained, deliberate attention. The paper was notebook paper, college-ruled, torn carefully along the spiral perforations. My parents' names at the top. Their Spokane address. My mother's vehicle, make, model, color, license plate. My father's vehicle. Below that, my sister's name and her address in Portland, her husband's name, the names of their 2 children, and, written in the same neat hand, in the same unhurried black ink, the name of the school their children attended. Their children are 7 and 9 years old. My niece and nephew, who I see at Christmas and whose school I have visited once and whose photographs my sister sends me on their birthdays, whose names exist in the world in the way children's names exist, spoken by people who love them, written in school enrollment forms and birthday cards and the patient institutional records of a society that maintains information about its members because it expects them to have futures. My name was last on the list. Below it, a single word, written with slightly more pressure than the rest, the letters pressed into the paper with the emphasis of someone making a point they want to last. Next. I want to tell you that my response was measured. That the training of 34 years of navigating difficult situations with practical competence produced a clear sequence of rational actions. I want to tell you that because it would be a neater story, and because the alternative, the truth, is not neat. The truth is that I stood in front of that wardrobe for a period of time I cannot account for, holding a piece of paper in a room that smelled like someone else's recent habitation, and the machinery of my reasoning simply stopped. Not panic. Not flight response. Something quieter and more complete than either, the specific cognitive arrest that occurs when the mind encounters information so far outside its operating parameters that it cannot locate a processing framework. Cliff pressed against my left leg. That's what restarted me. The physical weight of him, warm and alive and indifferent to the horror of the paper in my hands, demanding nothing except proximity. I looked down at him and something reconnected. I took photographs. Every item in the wardrobe, the kitchen pantry, the used pan. The tire tracks at the turn-off, which I photographed on my way out. I did not stay in the cabin that night. I drove the 22 miles back to the highway with my I-beams on and Cliff in the front seat. I had never allowed him in the front seat before that night, and I stopped at the general store in Talkeetna, which was closed, and called the Alaska State Troopers from the parking lot. The trooper who responded was out of the Palmer Post, which was a 90-minute drive, and arrived at 2 in the morning. Her name was Sergeant Dolan. She was methodical and unhurried in the way that competent people are unhurried, not dismissive of urgency but not destabilized by it either. She documented everything I had photographed and more besides. She took the list in an evidence bag. She took the sleeping bag and the stuffed sack. She noted the tire tracks at the turnoff and said she'd request a cast of the tread pattern. She asked me if I knew anyone who might have access to the cabin and who would have reason to compile this kind of information. I said no. She asked if there had been any incidents at my Spokane residence or my parents' residence, break-ins, unfamiliar vehicles, anything that had registered as wrong at the time. I thought about it carefully and said no, and then I thought about it again and remembered with the specific vividness that fear assigns to previously unremarkable details, that my mother had mentioned, in June, that someone had rung the doorbell and left before she got to the door. That my sister had said, casually, on the phone in July, that a car had been sitting on her street for 2 days and then wasn't there anymore. Small things. Things that exist in the ambient noise of modern life and get filed and forgotten because the alternative, treating every unfamiliar car as a threat, is not sustainable. They weren't forgotten anymore. Sergeant Dolan told me not to return to the cabin alone and to alert my family immediately. She said the investigation would proceed from the evidence collected and that I should expect a follow-up call within 48 hours. She gave me her card. She drove away, and I was alone in the Talkeetna General Store parking lot at 3:15 in the morning, and I called my sister. I called her at 3:15 in the morning, and when she answered, groggy and immediately frightened by the hour, I told her to lock her doors and I told her why. The investigation produced a person of interest, a man, identified from partial tread evidence and a tip from a property owner 2 miles from the cabin who had seen a truck matching the description parked off Forest Road in June. He was questioned. He was released. The case, as far as I have been able to determine through the channels available to a civilian not formally connected to the proceedings, is technically open and practically stalled, in the way that cases stall when the evidence is circumstantial and the jurisdiction is vast and the resources are the resources available to a trooper post serving a geographic area larger than most American states. My parents did not sell the cabin. They haven't been able to make a final decision about it, which I understand is the response of people for whom a symbol has been contaminated by an event they can't fully process. The cabin represents something they built. Selling it means acknowledging that what was built in it has been altered permanently by someone else's presence. My father doesn't talk about it the way he used to. The future tense has gone out of his references to it. I returned to Spokane 9 days earlier than planned and have not been back to Alaska since. My apartment is on the 3rd floor and I have a deadbolt and a chain lock and a security camera I installed myself on the 2nd week after coming home, positioned to cover the door and the hallway approach. I check it on my phone every night before I sleep. I run on Sundays but on a different route each week now, in a different order, at a different time, with Cliff beside me and my phone in my hand. The thing I think about, in the long honest hours of 3 in the morning when the city sounds of Spokane come through the window and I run the accounting of what that August produced, the thing I come back to, always, is the list. Not what was on it, though that is horrifying in ways that don't diminish with time. What I think about is what it represents. The labor of it. The sustained, patient, deliberate labor of assembling that information, names, addresses, vehicles, school names, and then transporting it to a cabin 60 miles northeast of Talkeetna and keeping it there, in a wardrobe, behind a sleeping bag. Not hidden. Not truly hidden. Set back, covered, but retrievable. The way you keep something you intend to return to. Someone had been in that cabin for a period of time I can't determine, sleeping in a bag on the couch, cooking on the propane stove, keeping their materials organized and their presence managed and their attention on a family in Spokane and Portland 3,000 miles away. Someone had sat in the specific isolation of that valley, the silence I remembered from childhood, the darkness I had found peaceful, the remoteness that it constituted, for my family, a kind of freedom, and used it as an operating environment. Used the cabin's distance from oversight, from neighbors, from any of the structures of ordinary civic life that make individual people accountable to other individual people. The isolation I had spent my whole childhood experiencing as abundance, the big sky, the silence, the space, had been, for someone else, utility. The forgotten geography at the end of a road that nobody maintained past mile 12 was not a vacation from the world. It was a location specifically selected because the world did not come there. Because what happened in that valley stayed in that valley unless someone drove out and told it. I had driven out. I had told it. I was alive and home, and my family was alive and had changed their routines and knew to watch for unfamiliar cars and to call me if anything registered as wrong. That's the version of the story I tell myself when I need to locate the thing that went right. But the other version, the one that lives at 3 in the morning, the one that cliff's weight against my feet doesn't fully suppress, is the version where I didn't go in August. Where I waited another year, or two, or until my parents made a decision and the property transferred and the cabin sat at the end of that road with its padlock intact and its wardrobe containing its sleeping bag and its list, and no one ever drove out there to find it. The version where next remained an open instruction rather than a discovered one. That version doesn't have an ending I can locate. It just has the list, in the neat black handwriting, and my name at the bottom of it. And the single word below. Waiting. The rent was $420 a month, which should have been the first warning. Nothing in Fairbanks is $420 a month. Not in a neighborhood with plowed roads and working heat and a landlord who answers his phone. Not in October, when the darkness is already consolidating its hold on the interior and the temperature has dropped to the level where exposed skin understands, for the first time, that it is not invincible. Not for a 2-bedroom house with a garage and a quarter-acre lot and a wood stove that the listing described as supplemental heating and which I would eventually understand was the primary heating system, the electric baseboards being decorative in the specific Alaskan way of things that work in theory and fail in practice when the theory encounters a January at -40. $420 a month should have told me something was wrong before I even drove the 40 minutes from downtown Fairbanks to look at it. But I was 29 years old and I had just driven 1,100 miles from Portland in a truck that needed its transmission looked at, and I had $7,000 in a savings account that was supposed to last me until the pipeline inspection job started in November, and $420 a month was the difference between arriving and not arriving. Between the version of the plan that worked and the version that didn't. I took the house. My name is Aaron Spear. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, in the specific comfortable mediocrity of a mid-sized Pacific Northwest city, coffee shops, bike lanes, a farmer's market on Saturdays that my mother treated as a social obligation and my father treated as an opportunity to buy expensive cheese. I went to University of Oregon for 2.5 years before the money ran out and the enthusiasm ran out slightly before that, and I spent the following years doing the kind of work that a person with some college and no particular credential does in the modern American economy: warehouse logistics, delivery driving, a 14-month stint at a data entry firm in Portland that paid $11 an hour and required me to sit for 8 hours a day inputting information that I never understood the purpose of, into a system I never understood the design of, surrounded by people I ate lunch with every day for over a year and never genuinely knew. The pipeline job came through a friend of a friend, the way jobs in Alaska tend to come, through networks of people who've made the decision to go north and who recruit from the people they trust because the work is physical and specific and the consequences of unreliable labor in a remote environment are more serious than they are in a Portland data entry firm. The pay was good. The schedule was 3 weeks on, 1 week off, which I'd been told was the rhythm you adapted to whether you adapted to it gracefully or not, and which I'd been told was easier in the winter because the darkness made time feel less linear anyway. I had thought about Alaska for years the way you think about things that feel both possible and implausible, the way you think about changing your life while sitting in a cubicle inputting numbers into a system you don't understand. Alaska was the place where a man could still matter in direct, physical ways. Where the work was real and the pay reflected the reality of the work, and the distance from everything familiar was, at least in the imagining of it, a feature rather than a defect. Where the person you'd been in Eugene and Portland was replaced by the person you could be in a place that didn't know you'd been anything else. I know how that sounds now. I knew how it sounded then, a little. But you have to understand the specific desperation of a life that is fine by every external measure and insufficient by every internal one, and you have to understand what it does to a man's judgment, over time, to live in that gap. It makes him willing to take houses for $420 a month without asking why. The house sat at the end of a road that was plowed by the borough, technically, but plowed in the aspirational sense of infrastructure maintained at the margins of available budget. The road was called Linder Creek Road on the county map and was called the road at the end by my landlord, a man named Doug Peterson, who bought the property as an investment in 2011 and who lived in Fairbanks proper and who communicated almost exclusively by text message in the abbreviated style of someone who decided that full sentences were an inefficiency he couldn't justify. He told me the property had been vacant for 7 months. He told me the neighbor's house, visible through the spruce trees to the east, maybe 80 yards away, had been empty even longer. He said the nearest house going the other direction was 3 miles back toward the highway. I moved in October 9th with everything I owned in the bed of my truck, which was not a great quantity of things and which fit in the 2 bedrooms and main room without requiring decisions about priority. I set up the wood stove and confirmed it worked. I confirmed the hot water ran. I confirmed the electric baseboards produced heat in the conceptual sense. I bought groceries at a Fred Meyer in Fairbanks and drove them out and stacked them in the kitchen and stood on the back porch in the October cold looking at the spruce forest and the sky above it, which was doing the thing Alaska skies do in October, producing a quality of light that feels elegiac, like the light of a world that knows it is about to be covered, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that I had moved towards something rather than away from it. That feeling lasted 11 days. The footprints appeared on the 20th. I know because I keep a notebook, a habit I developed in Portland as a way of managing the formless anxiety of days that felt identical to each other, giving them a distinction they didn't produce themselves. October 20th, I wrote, snow last night. First real accumulation. About 4 inches. Looks clean and total and completely undisturbed, which is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. I wrote that in the morning, standing at the kitchen window with coffee, watching the property white and smooth and perfect in the early gray light. I wrote it and meant it and believed it. The footprints were in the afternoon entry, went outside around 2 p.m. to split wood. Found tracks in the snow on the north side of the house, between the corner of the garage and the kitchen window. Human. Adult, I think, stride length and size look right. They come from the direction of the trees to the east and they go back the same way. They stop at the kitchen window. Just stop there, at the window, like someone stood there and looked in and then turned around and left. I reread that entry sometimes. The tone of it, calm, observational, methodical, is the tone of a man who has not yet understood what the footprints represent. Who is still operating in the register of normal explanations, cataloging data without yet having assembled it into a conclusion that his body was already working toward without his permission. I told myself the tracks were from a hunter. From a neighbor I hadn't met. From someone who'd simply walked past and stopped for a reason that was unremarkable and unalarming. The neighbor's house to the east had been empty for months, according to Doug Peterson, but empty, in rural Alaska, doesn't preclude visitation. People check on properties. People use their neighbor's land for hunting access. People have entirely mundane reasons for walking through spruce trees and stopping at a kitchen window. I called Doug Peterson anyway. He texted back, probably just someone passing through. Nobody nearby. 3 words of dismissal. The minimum necessary investment in a tenant's concern. I bought a motion sensor light for the north side of the house and installed it on the 22nd. I told myself this was practical rather than frightened, which was a distinction without a meaningful difference but which allowed me to maintain the narrative that I was a competent man managing a rural property rather than a frightened man alone in the dark at the end of a road in the interior of Alaska. The light tripped at 2:17 in the morning on October 26th. I know because I was awake. I've been sleeping badly, the sleep of a body that is alert in the way bodies become alert when they've registered a threat that the conscious mind hasn't fully processed, and the flood of light through the bedroom curtain was instantaneous and absolute, and I was at the window before I decided to be at the window. The north side of the property was illuminated and empty. Snow, spruce trees at the edge of the tree line, the corner of the garage. Nothing else. The light ran for its preset 30 seconds and went off, and the dark came back, and I stood at the window in the dark for a long time, long enough that the cold coming through the glass became something I could feel on my face, long enough that the spruce trees resolved from pure shadow into the specific textured darkness of trees, and I watched them and they were still. The morning showed me the tracks again. Same pattern, from the tree line, to the north wall, to the kitchen window. This time they continued, around the corner to the back door, where they stopped. Stood. The snow compression at the back door was deeper than at the kitchen window, which means more time, more weight, more stillness. Someone had stood at my back door in the dark and waited for something or considered something and then returned to the trees. The back door was locked. I had locked it. The lock was a standard residential deadbolt and it was engaged and the door was undisturbed. I checked it 3 times, the 3rd time crouching to look at the strike plate and the bolt itself, looking for the evidence of an attempt I could report. There was none. I called the Fairbanks Police Department non-emergency line and described the tracks. The officer who took my information was professional and kind in the way that people are kind when they are managing a call volume that makes extended engagement with any individual caller a resource allocation decision. He said he'd note it. He said if I saw anyone on the property to call 911. He said if I felt unsafe, I might consider whether my living situation was appropriate for my comfort level. My comfort level. I sat with that phrase for a long time. The coffee cup appeared on November 3rd. I found it in the morning when I went to the kitchen to start the wood stove. It was on the kitchen table, which is a sentence I have written and rewritten and which does not become less horrifying for the rewriting. On the kitchen table. A ceramic mug, not mine, a dark blue one with a handle chip on the left side, the kind of mug that comes from a set that has been in use for a long time. It held the residue of coffee that had been drunk and not washed out, a brown ring at the bottom, the dried trace of a liquid that had been hot and had been consumed and had been allowed to sit and dry. Not left as a forgotten item. Left as a used one. Someone had made coffee, or brought coffee, and sat at my kitchen table and drank it and left the cup there, and the used coffee cup is not the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part is that I had been in the house all evening. I had eaten dinner at that table. I had washed my own dishes at the sink 6 feet from where the cup now sat. I had gone to bed at 10:30 and the cup had not been there when I passed through the kitchen to turn off the light. All the doors were locked. All the windows were latched. I checked every one of them in sequence, starting at the front door and working clockwise around the house's perimeter, and they were all secure in the way they had been secure when I'd locked them the previous night, and the snow outside every window and door was undisturbed, and I stood in the middle of my kitchen holding a coffee cup that belonged to someone else and understood, with the specific clarity of a mind that has run out of alternative explanations, that the situation I was in was beyond what my judgment had equipped me to handle. I called Doug Peterson. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail that I tried to keep measured, and that became about 40 seconds in, no longer measured. I texted him a photograph of the cup on the table. He read it, the read receipt appeared, and did not respond for 6 hours, at which point he said, "That's weird. Did you have anyone over?" I drove to Fairbanks. I sat in a coffee shop on College Road for 3 hours and used the Wi-Fi and searched, for the first time, for the address of the property. The address search produced nothing unusual, but property records, Doug Peterson's ownership history, the standard digital trail of a rural residential parcel. Then I searched the address combined with the word incident, and then combined with police, and then, because I had crossed some threshold of reluctance into a willingness to know the thing I had been not knowing, combined with missing. The third search produced an article from the Fairbanks Daily Newsminer, dated February of the previous year. 14 months before I moved in. A woman named Teresa Vogt, 41, a nurse from Fairbanks, had been reported missing by her employer after failing to appear for 3 consecutive shifts. She had been renting a house on Linder Creek Road. She had last been seen by a colleague who dropped her off at the end of the plowed section of the road on a Sunday evening. Her vehicle was found at the property. Her personal belongings were found at the property. Teresa Vogt had not been found. The investigation was described as ongoing. The house had been vacant for 7 months before I moved in. Doug Peterson had been truthful about that. He had simply omitted the reason. I drove back to the property because my belongings were there, and because the pipeline job started in 4 days, and because the $7,000 in my savings account had become, over October, $5,600, and the math of leaving without somewhere to go was math I had not yet found a way to make work. I drove back with the windows up and the heat on and the radio at a volume that made the 40 minutes feel occupied rather than empty, and I parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a long time looking at the house. The neighbor's house was visible through the spruce trees. The house that had been empty even longer than mine. I had not looked at it directly in the 3 weeks I'd lived here. It existed in peripheral awareness the way nearby structures exist when you're not interested in them, registered but not attended to. I attended to it now. There was smoke coming from the chimney. Not a lot of smoke, not the robust column of a fire that's been burning for hours. The thin, pale output of a fire that was recently started, or recently attended, the specific translucency that means recent combustion rather than ongoing. I sat in the truck and watched it for 11 minutes. I counted. The smoke continued, thin, consistent, rising in the still air and dissipating above the spruce line. I called 911. For the first time, not the non-emergency line, 911, and when the dispatcher answered, I gave the address and described the situation in its entirety, from the footprints to the coffee cup to the article about Teresa Vogt to the smoke, and my voice was steady through most of it and not steady through the end of it, and the dispatcher told me to stay in my vehicle with the doors locked and not to approach the neighboring property. 2 troopers arrived 47 minutes later. They went to the neighboring house and I watched from the truck. I watched them knock. I watched them try the door. I watched them look at the chimney and at each other and make a radio call and then split up, one going to the front of the house and one going around the back. 7 minutes passed in which I could see one trooper and not the other, and then both of them reappeared at the front of the house and spoke to each other briefly, and then one of them walked toward my truck. The trooper who came to my truck was a woman named Officer Daines, who had the specific, cultivated neutrality of someone trained to deliver information without inflecting it with her own response to that information. She told me the house was unlocked. She told me there was evidence of recent habitation, food, bedding, a fire that had burned down to coals but was not fully extinguished. She told me there was no one in the house at present and no immediate evidence of criminal activity. Then she paused in the way that people pause when they have said the thing they were prepared to say and are deciding whether to say the thing they were not. She told me that the bedding in the house, the arrangement of it, the setup, had the appearance of having been used for an extended period. Not a night, not a week. Extended. She told me that among the items in the house, there were photographs. She did not describe the photographs in detail. She told me that some of them appeared to involve the property I was renting. She told me that the investigation team was being contacted and that I should plan to provide a full statement. She told me I should not stay at the property that night. I didn't. I drove back to Fairbanks and paid $112 for a motel room on the Old Stees Highway and sat on the bed with the lights on and my back against the headboard and Fairbanks visible through a gap in the curtains, the specific small city darkness of a night in November, the glow of gas stations and the orange of sodium streetlights, the ambient evidence of a populated place that was awake and occupied and maintained by the presence of other human beings. I had wanted isolation. I had driven 1,100 miles toward it. I had sat on a porch in the October light and felt, for the first time in years, that I was in the right place. That the distance from what I'd been was sufficient and the space around me was large enough to become something in. What I understood now, sitting in a motel room in Fairbanks with the lights on, was that isolation is not selective. It doesn't provide solitude only to the people who have chosen it. It provides cover to everyone equally, to the man trying to reset his life in the interior of Alaska, and to whatever had been living 80 yards away in the spruce trees, watching the kitchen window, learning the schedule, drinking coffee at the table and leaving the cup as, what? A test? A greeting? An announcement that the distance between us had already been made negotiable? Teresa Volk was not found during the investigation that followed. The neighbor's house produced evidence, photographs, materials, the record of an occupancy whose duration investigators estimated in months, possibly longer, but the person who had occupied it was not located. The case generated a suspect description that circulated through the Alaska State Trooper system and that I was shown, in the form of a composite sketch, when I gave my full statement 3 days later. I looked at the composite for a long time and said I couldn't confirm or deny it, because I had never seen the person, only the evidence of them, and evidence and person are not the same thing in the way that darkness is not the same thing as what the darkness contains. I went back to the house once, with 2 troopers present, to collect my belongings. The pipeline job had started and I was living in company housing in a work camp that was loud and crowded and institutional and absolutely, relentlessly populated with other human beings, which was not something I had thought to value until the alternative made itself known to me in the specific form of a coffee cup on a kitchen table. I drove out Linder Creek Road for the last time on a gray November afternoon with the troopers ahead of me and the spruce trees on both sides holding their snow and saying nothing, the way trees say nothing, the way this landscape says nothing, the way the interior of Alaska has always said nothing, vast and silent and utterly indifferent to what happens within it, to who comes and who goes and who is found and who is not, to the difference between a man who drove 1,100 miles to become something and what waited for him at the end of a road that ran for $420 a month. I packed in 40 minutes. I did not look at the neighboring house through the trees. I moved to Anchorage after the pipeline contract ended. I have a 1-bedroom apartment in a building with 16 other units and a parking lot that is never empty and a wall thin enough that I can hear my neighbor's television at night and have never, not once, found this annoying. I lock my door with the deadbolt and the chain. I have never in 18 months left a window unlatched. I sleep with a lamp on. Not for the light, which reaches nothing important and solves nothing practical. For the sound of it, the faint electrical hum of a thing that is on, a thing that is running, the smallest possible evidence that I am in a place that is occupied and maintained and present, that the space around me is not empty in the way the end of Linder Creek Road was empty, that the darkness outside the window is the ordinary darkness of a city that goes on existing through the night without requiring my vigilance to do so. Some nights it works. Some nights I am back at the kitchen table, looking at the blue mug with the chipped handle and understanding what it took from me, not the fear, not the violated sleep, not the weeks of retrospective horror in which I reconstruct every evening in that house and look for the moments I was watched without knowing I was watched. Those things are real and they are costly, but they are not the specific thing I mean. What it took was the version of myself that believed distance was cleansing. That a man could drive north far enough from what he'd been to arrive somewhere better. That the space between the life you had and the life you wanted could be crossed by geography. It can't. The geography just changes what finds you in the crossing. I know that now in my body, in the specific irreversible way that the body knows things it has been taught by experience rather than by reasoning. I know it in the way I check the locks twice. In the way I never sit with my back to an uncurtained window. In the way I scan, always, without deciding to scan, the faces around me in a restaurant or a parking lot or a hallway, looking for the quality of attention that is 1 register too sustained, 1 degree too still, 1 fraction of a second too slow to look away. I know it in the way a chipped blue coffee mug on a kitchen table will follow me, I think, for the rest of my life. Evidence of a proximity I never agreed to. Left by a neighbor I never met. Who is still, as far as anyone has been able to determine, out there.